The rain had been falling since mid-morning, and by the time the iron-gray sky turned the color of an old bruise, Cora Blackwell was still standing at her gate, her fingers wrapped around the cold, wet iron, her dark hair plastered flat against the sides of her face, watching the road that stretched empty and muddy all the way to the horizon. She had sent word 3 days ago. 3 days, a note carried by her neighbor's boy to the town of Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the year of our Lord 1882. The note had said simply that the back wall of her barn was failing, that the rain season was upon her, and that she needed a man who knew how to work timber. The livery owner in town, old Pete Cassidy, had told the boy that he knew just the fellow, a carpenter and handyman by the name of Vernon Dunlap, steady as a fence post, strong as a draft horse, and reliable as sunrise. Reliable as sunrise. Cora would have laughed if laughing had been something she felt like doing while standing in a cold October rain with water running down the back of her neck and into her collar. Reliable as sunrise, and here the sun had risen and set again since the hour she had been promised he would arrive, and there was still nothing on that road but mud and the occasional confused jackrabbit darting between the sage. She had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Thomas Blackwell, had died in the summer of '81 of a fever that came on fast and took him faster, leaving her with 40 acres of dry New Mexico land, a small herd of 7 cattle, a vegetable garden that required more attention than it ever gave back, and a barn that had always been slightly questionable in its structural integrity, but that Thomas had always said he would fix come spring. He never fixed it come spring. He never got the chance, and now the back wall was bowing inward at an alarming angle, and the 2 remaining horses she owned were stabled inside it, and Cora had spent 3 sleepless nights listening to the wind test the joints of that wall and imagining the whole thing coming down on her animals. She had 2 children, me, who was 9, and Eli, who was 6. They were inside the house right now, pressed against the window glass watching, their mother stand at the gate in the rain, with the particular fascination children have for their mother's stubbornness when it borders on spectacular. Cora turned back to the house once and held up a hand that meant stay inside, and 2 small faces disappeared from the glass. She turned back to the road. Nothing. She waited another 20 minutes, which felt like 2 hours, and then the road remained empty, and her patience, which had never been her strongest quality even in the best of times, finally ran dry along with whatever warmth had remained in her bones. She unlatched the gate, walked back through the mud, went inside, stripped off her soaked coat, hung it on the hook by the door, and said to no one in particular, in a voice that was quieter and more dangerous than shouting would have been, "Fine." That was the night she dragged 2 wooden sawhorses from the shed and propped them against the failing wall herself, working by lantern light while the rain drummed on the roof, and me held the lantern steady, and Eli handed her nails with the seriousness of a boy who understood that something important was happening. It was not a perfect repair. It would not last the winter. But the wall stayed up that night, and the horses were safe, and Cora went to bed at midnight with splinters in her palms and mud on her boots and a cold fury in her chest that had nowhere particular to go. The next morning, the sun came out. New Mexico after a rain was a different country. The sage turned silver green, the red dirt soil dark and rich smelling, the sky so blue it looked painted. Cora was out at dawn feeding the cattle, her splinter-sore hands wrapped around a bucket handle, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. She looked up. A man was coming down the road at an unhurried trot on a sorrel horse the color of a new penny, a bedroll tied behind the saddle, a carpenter's toolbox lashed on beside it. He was broad-shouldered and wore a brown canvas coat that had seen better days, a hat pulled low against the morning glare, and he sat his horse the way a man does when he has been riding all his life and stopped thinking about it somewhere around age 12. He turned in at her gate, which she had left unlatched, and stopped just inside it and looked at her. She looked back at him. "Morning," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. I am looking for the Blackwell property. I was told there is a barn needs attention. You are on the Blackwell property, Cora said. Then you would be Mrs. Blackwell. I would. I am Vernon Dunlap. Pete Cassidy sent me. I am sorry for the... You are late, Cora said. Vernon Dunlap opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Yes, ma'am, I sent that note 3 days ago. I was promised you would come the following day. I stood at that gate in the rain for 2 hours yesterday evening waiting for you. A flicker of something crossed his face. It might have been embarrassment. It might have been the beginning of an explanation. But Cora Blackwell's dark eyes were fixed on him with the particular quality of a woman who has spent a night propping up her own barn wall and is not in the mood for excuses, however valid they might be. And Vernon Dunlap, to his credit, seemed to understand this immediately. Yes, ma'am, he said again, quietly and without decoration. The barn is in the back. You can tie your horse at the post by the water trough. She turned and walked toward the house without looking back, and Vernon Dunlap dismounted from his sorrel horse, tied the animal at the post she had indicated, untied his toolbox, and stood for a moment looking at her retreating back with an expression on his face that was thoughtful, and perhaps just slightly impressed. He was 31 years old, Vernon Dunlap, born in Tennessee, raised on a farm outside of Nashville, and come west 15 years ago with nothing but a good back and a willingness to learn any trade that needed learning. He had been a ranch hand, a fence builder, a freighter, a carpenter, and briefly and unwisely a prospector in the Silver Hills north of Santa Fe, which had taught him mainly that his talents lay above ground rather than below it. He had settled in Harlan Creek 6 months ago, set up a small workshop behind the livery stable, and built himself a modest reputation for quality work and punctuality. Which was why, standing in Cora Blackwell's yard in the bright October morning, he felt the lateness of his arrival particularly keenly. It was not that he had been lazy or that he had forgotten. 2 days ago, riding out to the Blackwell property, his horse had thrown a shoe on a rock crossing, and he had spent the better part of a day walking the animal back to town on rough ground in the beginning of the rainstorm, arriving at the livery after dark with a lame horse and a considerable amount of mud on his person, and had then spent the rest of the night and the following morning sourcing a farrier and waiting for the animal to be fit to ride. It was, as excuses went, a perfectly good one. But he had looked at Cora Blackwell's face when she said "you are late," and he had understood that the correct thing to do was not to offer the excuse immediately, but to first demonstrate by action that his lateness was an aberration and not a pattern. So he took his toolbox and walked around to the back of the barn, and what he saw there made him stop and tilt his head and be quietly, thoroughly impressed. The back wall was propped with 2 sawhorses, wedged with timber scraps, and braced with what looked like the better part of a fence rail that had been cut and fit with reasonable skill. It was not professional work, but it was intelligent work, and it had clearly been done in a hurry, in the dark, in the rain, by someone who understood the principles of load-bearing pressure, even if they had never studied them formally. He stood for a while looking at it, and then he set down his toolbox and began to figure out what needed doing. Cora came out an hour later with a tin cup of coffee, which she set on the fence post nearest to where he was working without speaking to him, and then went back to the garden. Vernon drank the coffee and said nothing, because the gesture seemed to him like a peace offering of a specific and practical kind, and he received it as such. By noon he had determined that the back wall needed 3 new vertical supports and 2 new horizontal crossbeams, that 2 of the existing corner joints were failing, and that the roof on the back section would need patching before the next rain. It was a week's work, done properly. Maybe 5 days if he pushed. He found Cora in the garden, where she was pulling the last of the autumn squash from the vine with the efficiency of someone who does not waste a single motion. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, "I have had a look at the situation." She stood up and looked at him. In daylight, without the rain and her fury, he could see her clearly. She was perhaps 28, maybe 30, with dark eyes that were direct and watchful, a face that had been shaped by outdoor work and grief into something both strong and fine, and hands that were calloused at the palms in the particular way of a woman who had been doing a man's share of the labor. She was not beautiful in the way that the painted ladies in the saloon calendar on Pete Cassidy's wall were beautiful. She was beautiful in the way that good functional things are beautiful: a well-made saddle, a true fence line, water running clear over flat rock. Vernon Dunlap cataloged all of this in approximately 3 seconds and then concentrated very hard on looking at the barn. "The wall needs replacing in sections," he said. "The supports are gone, 2 corner joints have failed, the roof needs attention. I can have it sound by the end of the week if you have the materials I need, or I can ride to town for them." "What materials?" he told her. She thought about it. "There is timber in the shed from Thomas from last year. I do not know if it is enough. You can look." "I will look." He looked. There was enough timber for most of it, not all. He would need to make 1 trip to town for additional supplies, which he could do the following morning, early, and be back before midday. He told her this. "The following morning," she repeated, and there was something in the way she said it. "I will be back before noon," he said. "You said you would be here the day after I sent the note." "I know. And you were not." "I know that too. I had a horse go lame on the crossing rocks. I had to walk him back to town." She looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing accusatory in it. It was simply assessment, the way a woman who has been living alone for 14 months assesses everything, because everything now depends on her judgment. Was the horse all right? It was not the question he had expected. "He was. Thank you for asking." Something shifted in her face, very slightly, like the change in light when a cloud passes away from the sun. "All right. Be back before noon." "Yes, ma'am." He rode back to Harlan Creek that afternoon, slept in his workshop, rose before first light, collected the lumber he needed from the mill at the edge of town, loaded it in a borrowed wagon, and arrived at the Blackwell property at 10:30 in the morning, a full hour and a half before noon. Cora was on the porch when he pulled in through the gate, and she looked at him, and then she looked at the sun's position in the sky, and then she looked at him again, and the very corner of her mouth did something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "Early," she observed. "I had incentive," he said. He unhitched the wagon and unloaded the timber and began to work. She brought coffee again, and this time she did not immediately disappear. She stood near the fence, arms crossed, watching him work with the assessing eye of a woman who needs to know whether the work being done on her property is being done right. "You know what you are doing," she said after a while. It was not a compliment precisely, it was an observation. "I have been doing it a long time," he said. "How long have you been in Harlan Creek?" 6 months. "Where before that?" "Santa Fe, Albuquerque before that, Tennessee before all of it." "Long way from Tennessee." "It is," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, then, "I am from Missouri. We came out here 6 years ago." Thomas thought she stopped. He thought the land was good. "Is it?" "It is all right," she said carefully. "It is dry, but it is mine." He heard the weight in that last word and did not push on it. He turned back to his work. Her name was Cora Blackwell, née Harmon, and she had come out to New Mexico Territory from a farm in central Missouri with her husband Thomas when Me was 3, and she was herself 24 years old, full of the particular resilience of a young woman who has decided that wherever she goes she will make something of it. Thomas had been a good man, a steady man, though not, as it turned out, a man given to practical repairs. He had a talent for hope and a weakness for the idea that things would improve on their own if given sufficient time, which is a quality that serves a man reasonably well in matters of philosophy and rather poorly in matters of barns. When he died, he left Cora the land, the debt on the land, 7 cattle, the 2 horses, a vegetable garden, and the unfinished repairs. She had spent the first month of widowhood in a grief so complete it was almost physical, a weight she carried in her chest that made breathing effortful. Then, with the particular pragmatism of a woman with 2 children and a failing barn and 40 acres, and no one else, She had gotten up one morning and begun the very long work of making it through. She was good at it. She was better at it than she would have chosen to be, because the choice had not been given to her. But she was good at it, and she knew she was good at it, and there was a hard and private pride in that knowledge that she kept close and quiet and did not speak of to anyone. Vernon Dunlap worked through the first day with a focused, economical efficiency that she found, against her will, pleasant to observe. He did not waste motions. He did not make unnecessary noise. When Eli came out in the afternoon and stood at the barn door watching with 6-year-old intensity, Vernon did not shoo him away or ignore him. He glanced at the boy, considered him, and said, "Would you like to hand me those nails? The big ones in the left side of the box." Eli's face lit up as though the sun had come through the clouds specifically for him. He spent the rest of the afternoon being extremely serious and important about handing over nails. Mee was less easily won. She was 9 and possessed of her mother's instinct for wariness, and she observed Vernon Dunlap from a distance with narrowed eyes for the entirety of the first day. And when Cora asked her at supper what she thought, Mee said, "He knows what he is doing with the wood. I do not know yet about anything else." Cora thought that was a reasonable position and said so. The second day, Vernon arrived before 8 in the morning, which was earlier than she had expected. She was still in the kitchen, making biscuits, and she heard the horse and came out on the porch with flour on her hands and looked at him. "I said before noon," she told him. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, which was not entirely true since Harlan Creek was 8 miles away and she knew it. She went back inside and came out later with biscuits and coffee on a tray, which she left on the fence post, and Vernon ate them standing up because sitting down felt like something he had not yet been granted permission to do. He was making good progress. The new vertical supports were in, the 2 corner joints had been recut and rejointed with fresh timber, and the horizontal cross beams were half done. He worked with a precision that came from having done this kind of thing long enough that his hands knew what to do without waiting for his head to tell them. But he was also thinking about Cora Blackwell. Not in any way that seemed right to act on, not yet, maybe not at all. She was a widow who needed her barn fixed, and he was a man who fixed barns, and that was the extent of it. But he was thinking about the way she had stood at that gate in the rain, which Pete Cassidy's boy had mentioned when he brought the note, had said that the widow out on the Blackwell property had been standing at her gate in the pouring rain waiting, and something about the image of it had settled in Vernon's chest in a way that was hard to name but impossible to dismiss. A woman standing at her gate in the rain waiting for help that did not come. He had been the help that did not come, and he was going to be the last time that ever happened. On the third day he arrived early again, and this time Cora was already in the yard, and she looked at him with an expression that was becoming, gradually and reluctantly, something warmer than mere assessment. "You keep arriving early," she said. "I told you I had incentive," he said. "What incentive?" He looked at her steadily. "To prove I am not generally late, Mrs. Blackwell." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she said, "Call me Cora." Mrs. Blackwell was my mother-in-law, and she was a difficult woman. He smiled at that, and it was the first time she had seen him smile properly, and it changed his face considerably, opening it up and softening the lines that outdoor work had put there. He was not a handsome man in a fashionable way. He was handsome in the way of things built for use rather than display, strong lines, honest proportions, nothing wasted. "Vernon," he said, and held out his hand, which was calloused and dusted with sawdust. She shook it. Her own hand was work calloused too, and he did not treat it gently, which she appreciated more than a gentle handshake would have deserved. On the third afternoon it clouded over again and the air turned cold, and Cora came out and looked at the sky with the experienced eye of a woman who has been watching New Mexico weather for 6 years and said, "Rain again tonight maybe." "I can get the roof patch done today if I push," Vernon said. "I will help," she said. He looked at her. "It is not easy work. The pitch is." "I know what the pitch is," she said. "This is my barn." He considered this for a moment and then said, "Do you have a head for heights?" "I have a head for whatever needs doing," she said, and walked to the ladder without waiting for his response. They worked side by side on the barn roof for 2 hours, patching the weak sections with salvaged boards and fresh tar paper that Vernon had brought from town. And in that 2 hours, something shifted between them in the way that working alongside someone shifts things. Because there is a particular intimacy in shared physical effort, in the passing of tools, in the reading of each other's movements, in the small economy of two people trying to accomplish something that requires coordination. He learned that she was not afraid of heights. He learned that she could read a structure's weakness quickly and accurately. He learned that she had a dry, spare sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly from beneath the self-sufficient severity she wore like a coat, so that when she looked at a particularly crooked nail he had just driven and said, without inflection, "That is a creative angle," he startled into a laugh before he quite knew he was going to. She learned that he worked with great care and no ego, that he checked his own work constantly and without defensiveness, that when he made a mistake, he corrected it immediately and without drama. She learned that he had a habit of humming under his breath when he concentrated, something tuneless and absent-minded that she found inexplicably endearing. She learned that, when the wind came up and drove a needle of cold rain into her face, he was watching it happen from the corner of his eye and had shifted his body slightly to block the worst of the wind without making a performance of it. They came down off the roof as the sky opened up and walked quickly toward the house, and Cora held the porch door open and said, almost before she had decided to, "Come inside and eat something. The children have already eaten, but there is stew." He stopped with his boot on the first porch step and looked at her, and in his face there was a careful, conscious awareness of what being invited inside meant in the architecture of widowhood and propriety, and the small, sharp eyes of a small town, even 8 miles away. "If it is not a trouble," he said. "I would not have offered if it were," she said. So he came inside and ate stew at her kitchen table, and me sat across from him with the deliberate watchfulness of a 9-year-old conducting a character assessment, and Eli sat next to him and described, in considerable detail, his opinions on horses, frogs, and the relative merits of cornbread versus biscuits, and Vernon answered each topic with the appropriate gravity and interest, and somewhere in the middle of Eli's discourse on frogs, me's expression began, very slightly, to thaw. After supper, Vernon said he had better get on the road before it got too dark, and Cora walked him to the door, and he put on his coat and hat and turned to her with his hand on the door frame and said, "The wall will be done tomorrow. I will need to come back in 2 weeks to check the joints have held if that is agreeable." "It is agreeable," she said. "Good night, Cora." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sat in the air between them for a moment like the first note of a song. "Good night, Vernon," she said. "Ride carefully." The 4th day he finished the barn wall and the roof, and when he was done he walked around it 3 times, testing the joints, pressing the new supports, checking his work with the scrupulous honesty of a craftsman who cannot be satisfied by almost right. The wall was solid. The joints were tight. The roof would hold. He would stake his reputation on it, which in a town of 2,000 people meant something real. He found Cora in the garden again, and she looked up when he came around the corner of the house, and he said, "It is done. It is sound. Come and look." She came and looked, working her way around the barn in much the same methodical way he had, pressing joints, testing boards, checking the roof with her hand, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. When she was done she stood for a moment with her back to him, looking at the wall, and when she turned around something in her face was different, softer, or perhaps not softer exactly, but more open. "It is good work," she said. "Thank you. Very good work. Thank you for that too." She crossed her arms and looked at him. Thomas was going to fix that wall for 2 years. He was a good man, but not a practical one. It was the first time she had spoken of her husband in anything other than the briefest factual way, and the words came out with the careful quality of something that had been weighed before being set down. "I am sorry you lost him," Vernon said. "So am I," she said, and then simply honestly with no drama, "It has been hard. I expect it has. But we are managing," she said, and there was that private pride again, the quiet, fierce thing she carried. "More than managing," he said. "You propped that wall yourself in the dark in the rain and kept your horses safe. That is more than managing." She looked at him, and for a moment the self-sufficiency and the wariness and the practical severity all dropped away, and what was underneath was something that might have been the desire to be seen clearly and found to be enough. And in Vernon Dunlap's face was the straightforward recognition of someone who did see clearly, and who found her to be considerably more than enough. He cleared his throat. "I will be back in 2 weeks to check the joints." "I know," she said. "You mentioned it." "Purely professional," he said. "The warranty of the work." "Of course," she agreed, and the corner of her mouth did the thing that was almost a smile. He rode back to Harlan Creek in the long autumn afternoon light with the smell of fresh sawdust on his hands and the sound of her voice saying good night, Vernon in the back of his mind, and he thought about a woman standing at her gate in the rain, waiting, and how that image had moved him in a way he could not entirely account for and was not willing to ignore. The 2 weeks between his departure and his promised return were both longer and shorter than they should have been, for reasons that Cora was not entirely willing to examine directly. She was busy, as she was always busy. There were cattle to manage, a garden to put to bed for winter, the children's schooling to attend to in the hours after their work was done, Eli's letters and numbers, me's more advanced arithmetic, and the history books that me consumed with a ferocity that sometimes worried Cora with its intensity, and sometimes filled her with a pride so large it was almost painful. There was the firewood to stack against the coming cold, the root vegetables to cellar, the fences to check and patch, the long itemized inventory of winter preparation that a woman running a 40-acre property alone had to complete before the first hard frost. She was busy. She was efficient. She got through the days. But sometimes in the evening, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet and the fire was burning low, she found herself thinking about the 2 hours on the barn roof, the easy coordination of it, the dry comment about the creative angle, the warmth of someone else's laugh in her yard. She found herself thinking about the way he had eaten her stew at her table and listened to Eli's opinions on frogs with absolute seriousness. She found herself thinking about the directness of his gaze, the honesty of his face, the way he had not made excuses when she told him he was late even though he clearly had one available. She filed these thoughts into the category of things that were interesting but not necessarily actionable and went on with her work. Vernon arrived exactly 14 days later at 9 in the morning, and this time she was standing on the porch with coffee when he rode through the gate, and he stopped his horse and looked at her. "I knew you would be early," she said, and handed him the coffee. "How early was I this time?" 20 minutes. "I am improving," he said. She laughed. It was the first time she had really laughed in his presence. Not the almost smile, not the dry half-humor, but an actual laugh, brief and bright, and it startled both of them slightly. He drank the coffee and went to check the barn, and everything was tight and sound and exactly as he had left it, and he said so, and she said good, and he said he would be going then, and there was a pause. "You did not need to come all the way from town just to check joints," she said. "I said I would," he said. "People say a great many things. I say what I mean to do and then I do it," he said simply. "It is a habit I am attached to." She looked at him. "I noticed that." Another pause. The October air was clear and cold and smelled of sage and earth. "There is a social at the Methodist church in town next Saturday," he said carefully. "Pete Cassidy mentioned it. I thought if you and the children needed a reason to come into town, the children might like the music." It was, she recognized, the most cautious and considerate invitation she had ever received in her life. He had given her children as the stated reason and himself as the unstated one, and left her the entire width of the territory to decline without awkwardness. She looked at him for a long moment. "The children do like music," she said. "Then perhaps I will see you Saturday. Perhaps you will." He rode away, and she watched him go from the porch, and me appeared at her elbow in the doorway and said, "Are we going to the social?" "We are going to the social," Cora said. "Good," said me, with the composure of someone who had been conducting a character assessment for 2 weeks and had arrived at a provisional verdict. The Saturday social at the Harlan Creek Methodist Church was the kind of event that a small western town mounted with an ambition slightly in excess of its resources, which made it, in its way, more charming than something polished. There were 4 musicians playing fiddle and guitar and jaw harp and a somewhat uncertain harmonica. There were long tables covered with checked cloth, and every covered dish that every family in the county had brought. There were paper lanterns hung from the rafters with varying degrees of success, and there were children running through the space between the tables with the particular frantic energy of children who know that tonight the rules about running indoors have been suspended. Eli was one of these children within approximately 40 seconds of entering the building. Me walked close to Cora's side and looked at everything with careful eyes and said, "That ceiling is a considerable structural achievement," about the paper lanterns, which made Cora think her daughter might be spending too much time listening to barn repair conversations and not enough time being 9. Vernon was there. He was standing near the musicians with a cup of cider in his hand, talking to Pete Cassidy and a rancher whose name Cora did not know, and when she came in, he saw her immediately across the room. He said something brief to Pete Cassidy and came across to her, and he had cleaned up from his working clothes and wore a dark jacket and a pressed shirt and looked, she thought privately, quite presentable. "Cora," he said, "you came." "I said perhaps," she told him. "It was a strong perhaps." "I will count it as a reliable one," he said, smiling, and that smile again did its considerable work on his face. He got her a cup of cider and shook me's hand with great seriousness when introduced, and me shook back and assessed him with unblinking frankness and said, "My mother says you do good work." "That is very kind of her," Vernon said. "She does not say things she does not mean," me said. "She said that about you too, that you say what you mean." "Me," Cora said. "I am just confirming things," me said, and went to find her brother. Vernon looked at Cora with the particular expression of a man trying not to be too visibly delighted. "She is remarkable," he said. "She is terrifying," Cora said. "She gets it from me, apparently." They talked through the first hour of the social, standing near the wall with their cider cups, and what struck Cora about talking with Vernon Dunlap was the quality of his listening. He listened the way he worked, with complete and focused attention and without waste, and when he spoke it was to the point she had made rather than to a point he had been waiting to make. She talked about the property and the cattle and the difficulty of the winter ahead, and he talked about the work he had in town and the commission he had taken to build kitchen cabinets for the hotel that was going up near the railroad depot, and they discovered that they had both come west for the same unrepeatable combination of reasons that everyone who comes west has the need for space, the desire for something of their own, and the restless conviction that the place they were was not, quite, the place they were supposed to be. The musicians started a waltz, which nobody in Harlan Creek danced very well, but everybody danced with enthusiasm, and Vernon looked at Cora with the careful, questioning look that meant he was about to ask something he was aware might be declined. "Would you like to dance?" he said. She looked at the dance floor, which was full of cheerful, graceless motion. "I have not danced since Thomas died," she said. "I understand. We do not need to." She looked at him. "I did not say I did not want to." She held out her hand. He was not a graceful dancer. He was steady and capable and moved with the same deliberate, unhurried competence he applied to everything, and she found herself laughing again, genuinely, as they navigated the chaotic floor, and he laughed too, and it was easy in a way that she had not expected easy to feel, and this was the thing that moved her, not the handsomeness or the competence or the reliability, though she valued all of those, it was the ease. The simple, uncomplicated ease of being with someone and not having to work at it. She had not realized how much she had missed ease. They rode home in the wagon at 9 o'clock, both children asleep against her sides before they reached the edge of town, and Vernon rode alongside on his sorrel horse so that he could help her get the children inside when they arrived. He carried Eli in, because Eli was dead weight and Cora had her hands full with the lantern and the wagon horses, and he laid the boy down on his cot with a gentleness that was entirely natural and unself-conscious. And me, he walked to her room door and said good night, and me, half asleep, said, "Good night, Vernon," in a mumble that was the most natural thing in the world. He and Cora stood on the porch after in the cold night air, and the stars above New Mexico were extravagant, that particular western sky that seems to have more stars than sky, and the night was very quiet. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight." "Thank you for coming," he said, a pause. The coyotes were starting up somewhere in the distance. "I am glad the barn is fixed," she said, which was not entirely what she meant. "So am I," he said, which was also not entirely what he meant. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the honesty that was his defining quality and the directness that was hers met in the middle somewhere, and made the next thing simpler than it might have been. "I would like to come back," he said. "Not for the barn, for you." She was quiet for a moment, and the coyotes sang their strange, thin song in the dark. "I would like that," she said. He nodded. He put on his hat and stepped off the porch and untied his horse and swung up into the saddle, and before he rode he looked back at her once, standing on the porch in the lantern light, and she raised her hand and he rode away into the dark. He came back the following week, and the week after that, and by November he was coming out twice a week, on Thursday evenings and Sundays, because Thursdays were the evening Cora had declared belonged to things that were not work, and Sundays the afternoon after church. He would ride out in the afternoon, and they would walk the property together, checking fences and discussing what needed doing, and then they would sit on the porch or at the kitchen table and talk, long, wide-ranging conversations that moved from the practical the question of whether the root cellar was deep enough, whether she needed more firewood, whether the northeast fence was worth repairing, or whether she should simply contract the pasture, to the less practical, to the things they thought about. The books they had read or wished they had read, the country they had seen, the country they hoped to see, the way the light hit the red hills to the west in the late afternoon and made the whole world look briefly and impossibly beautiful. Me began to warm to him in the measured, reluctant way of a child who has decided to trust someone, but intends to make that decision felt. She would show him her lessons, sitting across the table, and he would look at them with genuine interest. And sometimes he would say something that made her think harder about a problem, not the answer but a different angle on the question, and she found she appreciated this in the way a serious mind appreciates someone who takes it seriously. Eli simply loved him, as small children love reliable and interested adults, completely and without complication. In November, Vernon came on a Thursday evening and found Cora trying to fix the hinge on the root cellar door, which had rusted through, and he sat down beside her in the cold and fixed it with the tools he kept in his saddlebag, because he had learned by now that there was always something that needed fixing at the Blackwell property, and he had accordingly begun carrying his tools as a matter of habit. Cora watched him work and said, "You carry your tools because you know there will always be something here that needs doing." "That is one reason," he said. "What is the other?" He kept his eyes on the hinge. "Because I like coming here." She was quiet for a moment. "Vernon." "Yes." "I have not since Thomas. I have not let myself." "I know," he said gently. "I am not sure I am ready," she said, "for whatever this is." He set down the tool and looked at her fully and directly. "Then we will go at whatever pace is right. I am not going anywhere." She looked at him. "You are very steady." "I am," he agreed. "It is not always an interesting quality." "It is the most interesting quality I know," she said, with a firmness that was the firmest compliment she had ever paid anyone. He smiled, and she reached out and took the tool from his hand and finished the hinge herself. And he let her, because by now he understood that she finished things herself not because she needed to prove something, but because finishing things herself was simply how she was made. The first time he kissed her was in December, the first week of it, when the cold had come down properly from the north, and the mornings were frozen hard, and the sage was silver with frost. He had come out on a Sunday, and they had spent the afternoon splitting wood together, because Cora had decided the woodpile was insufficient, and had attacked it with a determination that was slightly disproportionate to the immediate need. And Vernon had taken the second axe without being asked, and they had worked side by side through the cold afternoon, until the woodpile was built up to a height that would have seen them through 3 winters, and then they had stood looking at it in the fading light, their breath coming out in visible clouds, and Cora had said, "That should do it," with a satisfaction that was deeply, completely genuine. And Vernon had looked at her, flushed with cold and exertion, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, and had said, "Cora," and she had looked at him, and he had kissed her. It was brief and careful and warm in the cold air, and when it ended she stood for a moment with her eyes closed, and when she opened them they were very bright. "Vernon Dunlap," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are not going to be late for anything ever again," she said. "Am I clear?" He laughed. "Completely clear." "Good," she said, and kissed him this time without the carefulness, and the cold air and the smell of split wood and the frosted sage and the long blue New Mexico winter light were all around them, and it was exactly right. Christmas came to Harlan Creek with the particular quality of Christmas in the high desert, cold and starlit and very quiet, the kind of quiet that sits deep in the bones of a place. Cora had decorated the house with dried orange slices and pine boughs she had gathered from the foothills, and she had made presents for the children, a new rag doll for me, who was 9, and believed she was past rag dolls, but had been privately observed by Cora looking at the one on the shelf with a wistfulness that said otherwise, and a carved wooden horse for Eli, which she had done herself by lamplight in the evenings over 2 weeks. Vernon arrived on Christmas Eve with presents of his own, which he left at the door in a modest stack, a book on American history for me, which made the girl's face go briefly incandescent before she controlled it back to composure, and a small leather horse collar sized for a toy horse for Eli, who immediately applied it to the wooden horse and was satisfied. And for Cora he brought a small iron door latch, finely made, with a decorative scrollwork pattern on the plate. She looked at it. "I made it," he said. "I thought you should have a fine latch on your front door." She turned it over in her hands. It was beautifully made, the scrollwork clean and precise, the iron dark and smooth. It was practical and it was beautiful, and it was the most perfectly him thing he could possibly have given her, and she looked up at him with eyes that were doing something she generally preferred them not to do in front of other people. "It is the most," she stopped. "Thank you, Vernon. You are very welcome," he said. He stayed for Christmas Eve supper, and the children hung their stockings and Cora read to them from the Bible by the fire the way she always did, and Vernon sat in the chair by the window and listened, and the firelight played on the walls, and it was the kind of evening that settles into a person's memory and stays there. By January, people in Harlan Creek had begun to notice and comment, in the way of small towns, which is to say with great interest and varying degrees of delicacy. Pete Cassidy told Vernon that he was glad to see it. The pastor's wife, a Mrs. Ellerby, told Cora at the dry goods store that it was a fine thing for the children to have a man about, and left the implication hanging in the air like smoke. One of the rancher's wives, a woman named Dolores Vega, whose family had been in the territory long before it was a territory, pulled Cora aside at the market and said, in the forthright and kind manner that was Dolores' way, "He is a good man, that Dunlap. Solid. My husband says he is the best carpenter in 3 counties, but more than that, he is a good man. There is a difference." Cora received all of this with the composure of a woman who has learned to take the world's opinions in carefully measured doses and said very little in return. In February, Vernon asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it. He was not that kind of man. He came on a Sunday afternoon when the children were visiting the neighbor's family 2 miles down the road, and Cora was at the kitchen table doing the accounts, which she always did on Sunday afternoons because they required a certain quality of grim concentration that was easier without small people nearby. And Vernon sat down across from her and waited until she had finished the column she was working on, and then he said, "I want to ask you something." She put down her pen and looked at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to be here. I want to build things here with you and for you, and I want to know if that is something you want." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he felt the beginnings of an uncertainty he had not allowed himself before. "It has been 14 months, she said, since Thomas. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to stop grieving him. I am not asking you to choose between what you had and what we could have. They are not the same thing and do not need to be compared. I am just asking." She looked down at her accounts and then looked back at him, and in her face was the full complexity of what it meant to be asked this question. The grief and the long solitude and the hard-won independence and the fear of needing someone again. And underneath all of it, underneath the practical severity and the self-sufficient pride, the deep, ordinary human hunger for partnership, for ease, for someone to hand the second axe to. "You would stay on the property," she said, "if that is what you want. I can work from here as well as from town. The children are wonderful," he said. "Me already conducts quarterly reviews of my character. I expect to remain in good standing." She laughed, and her voice was rough with it. "You have thought about this." "I have thought about very little else since October," he said honestly. She looked at him. The fire was burning low and the afternoon light was the flat silver of a New Mexico February, and she could hear the wind moving around the corners of the house, and the walls were solid, and the barn was solid, and the latch on the front door was a piece of iron made with care and attention by the hands of the man sitting across from her table. "Yes," she said. "Vernon Dunlap, yes." He reached across the table and took her hands in his, and she held on. They were married in April, when the desert was briefly and magnificently in bloom, the prickly pear putting up its improbable scarlet flowers, the ocotillo blazing orange against the red earth, and the sky so deeply blue that it looked like something that should not be possible above a world as ordinary and difficult as this one. The ceremony was at the Methodist Church in Harlan Creek, small and practical by design, attended by Pete Cassidy and his wife, Dolores Vega and her husband Roberto, the pastor and Mrs. Ellerby, and perhaps 20 other people who were close enough to count. Me stood beside her mother as maid of honor, 9 years old and perfectly composed, wearing the white collar Cora had sewn onto her church dress for the occasion, and Eli stood beside Vernon in his capacity as ring-bearer and general enthusiast. And when the pastor asked if anyone had objections, and Eli said, loudly, "I do not," the entire church laughed, and Vernon looked down at the boy and said quietly, "I appreciate the support," and Eli beamed. Cora wore a blue dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Santa Fe, the color of the sky just after sunset, and she walked down the aisle of the Methodist church on her own arm because that was how she chose to do it. And when she reached Vernon, he turned and looked at her, and his face was the most open she had ever seen it, all of the composure and the careful restraint set aside for a moment. And she thought, standing there looking at him in the blooming April desert, that this was what reliable looked like from the inside. This was what she had been standing at her gate waiting for. Not just the man who would come and fix the wall, but the man who would come and stay. "I do," she said, and "I do," he said, and it was done. He moved out to the Blackwell property the following week, his toolbox and his bedroll and his sorrel horse, and the small accumulated things of a man who had spent 15 years traveling light. He built a workshop behind the barn, because the commute to Harlan Creek was manageable, but the work that came to him now came to him. People drove out with commissions since his reputation had only grown, and it was better to have the space. He extended the porch of the house by 6 feet on the south side, because the south side got the afternoon sun, and Cora had mentioned once, briefly, that she wished there was somewhere to sit in the afternoon light. He did not mention that he was doing it. He simply did it, on a Wednesday in May while Cora was in town for supplies. And when she came back and drove through the gate, she stopped the wagon and got down and walked around the new porch extension and put her hands on the fresh railing and stood in the afternoon sun. And then she turned around and looked at him. "When did you—" "Wednesday," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Eli can help you check the nail set in the far boards tomorrow. He has been asking for work." "He can," Vernon agreed. She nodded and went inside to start supper, and outside Vernon stood in the afternoon light on the south-facing porch extension and smiled at the desert for a while. The spring and summer moved through the Blackwell Dunlap property with the rhythms of a working life, and they were good rhythms, full and purposeful. Vernon took on a big commission in June, the construction of a new general store for a family named Alderman who were coming out from Kansas, and he spent 3 weeks in Harlan Creek overseeing the project, coming home on Fridays and leaving again Mondays. And Cora ran the property through that period as she had always run it, competently and without complaint, but with the difference that there was now someone to come home to on Friday evenings, someone to tell the week's small and large events to. Someone sitting across the supper table who made the telling of things worthwhile. Eli had taken to following Vernon around the workshop with the dedication of an apprentice, and Vernon had, without formal declaration, begun teaching the boy the basics of woodworking. How to hold a plane, how to set a nail, how to read the grain of the wood before you cut against it. Eli was 6 years old and his hands were small, and he dropped things and hit his fingers and made joints that did not precisely fit. And Vernon corrected each mistake with patient, unhurried specificity, saying not that is wrong but this is how. And Eli absorbed it with the focused attention of a child learning something that matters. Me, who had turned 10 in March, was less interested in woodworking but increasingly interested in the world beyond 40 acres of New Mexico desert. She had read every book in the house and the school's modest library, and she had a teacher in Harlan Creek, a young woman named Miss Pryor, who had recognized me's particular kind of intelligence early and was feeding it with whatever she could find. Vernon, on a trip to Santa Fe for supplies in July, spent 2 hours in the bookshop there buying an armful of books he thought me would want, and brought them home and stacked them on the table, and me came and looked at them and then looked at him and said, with the gravity of someone distributing the greatest currency she possessed, "Thank you, Vernon. These are good choices." "High praise," Cora told him that evening quietly. "I know," he said, equally quietly, and looked pleased. In July, Cora told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning early before the children were up, standing in the kitchen while the coffee was still heating on the stove, because she was a woman who delivered news directly and without elaboration. She said, "I am expecting Vernon, February, I think." He set down his coffee cup and stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and took her hands and looked at her face, searching it with the directness that was his way. How are you?" he said. "I am well. I am early still and uncertain, but I think February." "Are you happy?" he said. She looked at him. "I am happy," she said, with a certainty and a quietness that made it true. He held her for a moment in the early morning kitchen, and outside the desert was just beginning to warm up and the birds were starting, and inside the house the children were still asleep and everything was very still and right. "A boy," he said into her hair. "I think it will be a boy." "You cannot know that." "I cannot," he agreed, "but I think so." She pulled back and looked at him. "And if it is a girl?" "Then it is a girl," he said simply, "and she will be magnificent like her mother and her sister." Cora held his face in her hands for a moment, and then she let go and turned back to the stove, and Vernon sat down and drank his coffee, and outside the New Mexico morning opened up bright and clear. They told me and Eli at supper, and Eli immediately and confidently declared that the baby's name would be Frog, a position from which he could not be moved for several days despite sustained argument from multiple parties, and me looked at her mother and said, quietly, "Are you all right, Mama?" with the particular attentiveness of a child who has watched her mother carry things alone and does not want that to be the case anymore. "I am more than all right," Cora said. "I promise you." Mee nodded, satisfied, and returned to her supper. The summer progressed and the pregnancy progressed with it, and Cora continued to run the property with her usual efficiency and refused to slow down by more than she strictly had to, which was a fact Vernon accepted because he had married the woman knowing who she was and had no intention of trying to make her someone different. He simply made sure the heaviest work was done before she could do it herself, which meant rising earlier and moving faster, and occasionally arriving in a field or at a fence line to find Cora already there, and looking at him with an expression that said she knew exactly what he was doing, and he would shrug and they would work together. In August, Roberto Vega rode out with the news that there had been a fire at the livery stable in town, and old Pete Cassidy's family had lost not just the livery but the small house beside it. Pete Cassidy was 71 years old and had sent Vernon to the Blackwell property in the first place, and Cora said, immediately, that the Cassidys would come and stay with them until something could be arranged, and Pete and his wife Edna were installed in the second bedroom, and their horse in the repaired barn, and that was that. Pete Cassidy spent the first 2 days sitting on the south porch in the afternoon sun looking devastated, and on the third day Vernon sat down beside him and said, "Tell me exactly how the livery was built. I want to know the measurements and the layout." Pete looked at him. "We are going to rebuild it," Vernon said. "I will organize the work. I need you to tell me how it was." Pete Cassidy, 71 years old and exhausted, looked at Vernon for a long moment and then sat up a little straighter and began to talk. And within an hour he was drawing the floor plan in the dust with a stick, and the devastation in his face had been replaced with something purposeful. And Cora, watching from the doorway, thought that this was one of the things Vernon Dunlap did that was not loud or obvious but was quietly extraordinary. He gave people work. And in the work gave them back their sense of themselves. The rebuilding of the Cassidy livery was a community effort, the way things in small western towns often were, because everyone needed the livery and everyone knew Pete, and Vernon organized it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. By September it was done, sounder than the original, and Pete Cassidy shook Vernon's hand with both of his own and said, "I sent you to fix a widow's barn and look what happened," and then looked embarrassed about saying it, and Vernon laughed and said, "The best thing Pete Cassidy ever did," and meant it completely. Autumn came again, the second autumn, and with it the first cold that reminded them the year was turning. Cora was large with the baby now, moving with the particular careful deliberateness of a woman in her final months, and the children had settled into their new rhythms, me at school, Eli in the workshop with Vernon on the days he was not at school, the household running with the particular warmth of a place that has found its right configuration. There were nights, cold, clear nights in October and November, when Cora and Vernon sat on the south porch after the children were in bed, wrapped in blankets against the cold, and the stars were the extravagant western stars, and they talked, or did not talk, with the ease of two people who have learned each other thoroughly enough that silence is its own kind of conversation. One such night, Cora said, "I used to stand at that gate and feel very alone." Vernon turned to look at her. "Not sad exactly," she said. "I was too busy to be sad most of the time, but alone, the way you are alone when you are the only person responsible for all of it." "You are not alone now," he said. "No," she said, "I am not." He took her hand under the blanket and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that looking at the desert stars, and the coyotes started up somewhere to the north, and the night air was cold and clean, and the house behind them was warm. "I was very angry at you," she said, "when you were late. I know, 2 hours in the rain, Vernon, 2 hours." "I know that too," he said. "I have not forgotten it. I told you I would not let you forget it. You were true to your word." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I was so angry because I needed you so badly and you were not there, and it felt like every time I had needed something that was not there. The repairs Thomas did not make, the help that did not come, all of it. You became the particular target of a general anger. That is a fair description of what happened, he said. And then you arrived and did not make excuses and asked your horse was all right. You asked about the horse, he said. I know, she said. I was trying to be gracious while still being angry. It was complicated, he laughed. You managed it well. She tilted her head up and looked at him. This man who had come down the road a year ago on a penny-colored horse with a toolbox tied to his saddle, who had never been late again, who had fixed more things than the barn, who had listened to her, who had carried Eli to bed and bought me books and rebuilt Pete Cassidy's livery and built her a south-facing porch and given her ease after a very long time of having none. Vernon, she said. Yes. I am very glad you came. So am I, he said. More than I can tell you. She squeezed his hand under the blanket and turned back to the stars, and they sat in the cold night until the fire inside had burned low, and then they went in. In February, on a cold, clear night that was bright with stars, Cora's labor began, and by the early morning of a Tuesday, with the sky outside the window turning from black to gray to the pale rose of a desert dawn, their son arrived. He was large and healthy and extremely vocal about his opinions on the matter, and when the midwife, a stout and efficient woman named Mrs. Paulson, laid him in Cora's arms, Cora looked at him for a long time, at the red and furious face and the clenched fists, and the absolute perfect newness of him. Vernon was beside her, his hand on her shoulder, looking at his son for the first time, and his face was the most unguarded thing Cora had ever seen, stripped of all its competence and composure and filled with something that had no name but awe. I told you, he said softly. You told me nothing for certain, she said, but she was smiling. Eli, when he was allowed in, stood at the foot of the bed with very large eyes and said, Is his name Frog? His name is not Frog, Cora said firmly. James Thomas Dunlap, Vernon said, and looked at Cora, who had not known he intended to give the baby Thomas's name as a middle name, and found her throat suddenly full. James Thomas Dunlap, she confirmed. Eli considered this. We could call him Jamie, he offered. We could call him Jamie, Vernon agreed. Mee was in the doorway behind Eli, and she looked at her mother and then at the baby and then at Vernon, and something in her face settled into a peace that had been 13 months in the building, ever since a man on a sorrel horse had ridden through the gate and been told he was late. Jamie, she said softly. Hello, Jamie. Spring came again to the Blackwell Dunlap property, and it was a spring that felt different from the previous ones, fuller and more solid, the way a year that has been properly completed feels different from a year still in the middle of itself. The new baby was in his cradle on the south porch in the afternoons, because the light there was good, and Cora had decided he should have sun on his face from the beginning, and Eli watched him with a proprietorial attention that was both touching and occasionally slightly alarming in its intensity. And Mee read her books on the porch beside them, and looked up every few minutes to check on things with the composure of a person who has decided to take responsibility for the entire situation. Vernon built a new cradle for Jamie from walnut wood he had bought specially, with a carved runner that he had made over several evenings, and Cora had found him at it one night late, working by lamplight with the small, careful tools, and had stood in the doorway for a while watching him work, the lamplight on his face, the focused quietness of him, and had felt the fullness of things so completely that it made her eyes sting. The cattle herd had grown to 12, because Vernon had bought 5 more in the fall, and the property was running well. They had taken on a hired hand, a young man named Arturo Vasquez who was 17 and could ride anything, and was scrupulously honest and worked with a tirelessness that made even Vernon tired to watch. Arturo had been born in the territory, his family among the old Spanish families whose presence in New Mexico predated the American government by 2 centuries, and he worked the Dunlap land with the ease of someone who has always known this particular earth. There was a day in April when Vernon rode into Harlan Creek for supplies and came back in the afternoon with the wagon, and as he came through the gate Cora was on the porch with Jamie on her hip, And the sight of him coming through that gate on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon with a wagon load of flour and lamp oil, and a bolt of blue fabric he had gotten for Cora because he had passed the dry goods store, and it was the color of her wedding dress, struck her as the most beautiful thing she had seen in a long while. She came down the porch steps and he climbed down from the wagon and she said, "You are back early." And he said, "I hurried." And she stood looking at him in the April afternoon with their son on her hip and the sage blooming silver green around the fence posts and said, "I see that." He took the baby, because Jamie reached out for him with both arms, which was Jamie's most endearing quality, and Cora went to see about the wagon, and Vernon stood in the April sun holding his son and looking at the property that had been Cora's and was now theirs, the sound barn and the extended porch and the workshop, and the root cellar with its good new hinge, and the front door with its iron latch with the scrollwork detail, and felt the particular deep satisfaction of a man who has put himself in exactly the right place. "You are thinking something very pleased with itself," Cora said, coming back around the wagon with a sack of flour over one shoulder. "I am thinking several things," he said, and took the flour sack without breaking stride. "Give me back the baby," she said. "He is comfortable," Vernon said. "The baby and the flour are both mine, Vernon Dunlap." "The baby is emphatically also mine," he said. Jamie, for his part, grabbed at Vernon's chin with small, determined fingers which settled the matter. That summer, Eli turned 7 and had his first real woodworking lesson that produced an object of recognizable function. A small shelf, 3 boards wide and slightly uneven at the top, but solid in its joints, which Vernon mounted on the workshop wall with ceremony, and Eli stood looking at it with an expression that would not have been out of place on a man who had just completed a cathedral. Me turned 11 in March and had been corresponding by letter with Miss Pryor, who had left Harlan Creek for a position at a school in Santa Fe, and the letters were full of the names of books and the descriptions of places, and Cora read them sometimes and thought about the woman her daughter was going to be, and it was not a small woman. It was not a woman who would stay on 40 acres of desert forever. And she felt the bittersweet complexity of that with the honesty of a woman who always looked at things clearly. One evening in September, when Me was doing her lessons at the kitchen table and Eli was asleep and Jamie was in his cradle and Vernon was on the porch with his coffee, Cora sat down across from her daughter and said, "Miss Pryor says the school in Santa Fe has a program for older students. You would board there." Me looked up. Her pen was still in her hand. "It would be in 2 years," Cora said. "When you are 13, if you want it." Me set down the pen. Would it be all right?" "To afford it. We will make it all right," Cora said. Me looked at her mother for a long moment, and the bright eyes that were Cora's eyes were doing something they did not often do. "You would miss me," she said. "Ferociously," Cora said. Me crossed the table and hugged her mother with the arms of a child who is not yet ready to have stopped being one, and Cora held her daughter and looked over her head at nothing, and then Me pulled back and sat down and picked up her pen and said with great composure, "Tell me more about the program." In October, exactly 1 year to the month after Vernon Dunlap had ridden through Cora Blackwell's gate on a penny-colored horse and been told very directly that he was late, Cora and Vernon sat on the south porch after supper in the cool evening air, Jamie asleep inside and the older children doing their evening reading, and the stars coming out one by one over the dark hills. "1 year," Vernon said. "Since you arrived," she said. "Since I was late," he said. "Since you were unconscionably late," she confirmed. 2 hours in the rain, Vernon. You have said. I will keep saying it. I told you I would never let you forget it." "And you have been true to your word," he said, as he had said before. She looked at him sidelong, and the almost smile was there, and it was warmer now than it had been a year ago, warmer and more open, because a year of being seen clearly and found to be enough does that to a person. "Are you glad I did not let you forget it?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Without the 2 hours in the rain," he said, I would have arrived and done the job and ridden back to town, and you would have paid me, and that would have been the end of it. The lateness made you angry. The anger made you look at me. And the looking made, he gestured briefly at the house and the land and the south porch and the light in the windows, all of this. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a generous interpretation. I do not think it is wrong." She looked at the desert, at the dark shapes of the hills against the stars, at the silver sage, at the far line of the road that she had stood at the gate watching for 2 hours in the rain, and she thought about standing there, soaked and cold and furious and alone, and she thought about everything that had come since. "No," she said, "I do not think it is wrong either." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to lean into things that were solid and trustworthy, without reserve, without the armor she had worn for 14 months of widowhood, and they sat in the October night listening to the coyotes and the wind. "You will never be late again," she said, not as an accusation this time, but as the statement of a fact. "Never," he said. "Not for anything. Not for supper, not for sunrise, not for anything that matters." "Not for anything that matters," he agreed. She turned to look at him. "And everything matters," she said. "Everything," he said. The night deepened around them, and the fire inside had burned to good red coals. And inside the house, Jamie slept in his walnut cradle, and Eli dreamed his serious small dreams, and Mee read her books in the lamplight, preparing for a future that would be hers and hers alone. And outside on the south-facing porch that Vernon had built because Cora had mentioned once that she wished there was somewhere to sit in the afternoon light. A woman who had stood at her gate in the rain waiting for help that did not come sat beside the man who had come, finally, and stayed. And they were content. The following spring brought more changes to the Dunlap property, as spring in the territory always brought change, relentless and green. Arturo Vasquez, their hired hand, announced that he was to be married to a girl from a family south of town, a match he had been building toward quietly for months in the way of a careful young man, and Cora and Vernon attended the wedding in April, which was held on the Vasquez family land in the old tradition, with musicians who played under a sky so blue and so wide it seemed to cover everything. And Cora held Jamie on her hip and watched Arturo and his new wife dance, and thought that the territory was full of this, full of the ordinary, extraordinary business of people building lives in difficult, beautiful country, and it was good to be part of it. The hotel near the railroad depot, whose kitchen cabinets Vernon had built, had become a meeting point for travelers coming through on the railway, and through it came a wider current of the world newspapers from back east, goods from places that had not existed as supply sources a decade ago, and occasionally news that changed the shape of things. The railroad was coming closer, and with it the particular double-edged quality of progress, the new connections and the changed rhythms, the town growing and filling with people who did not know its old shapes. Vernon watched it with the careful attention of a man who has been in enough places to know how places change, and to want to preserve what is worth preserving. He was not opposed to the railroad. He had benefited from the improved supply of materials. His workshop output had increased, and he had taken on 2 apprentices in the last 6 months, both young men from the territory who were learning the trade with the earnestness of people who understand that a skill is a kind of freedom. He saw this clearly and was glad of it. But he also saw the way that change could ride through a community and not ask what it displaced, and he thought about this, and talked to Cora about it in the evenings, and she thought about it too, because Cora Blackwell had grown up in Missouri and watched the way the world moved through places and not always gently. And she had been in the territory long enough to see whose land had been taken, and whose presence had been made inconvenient by the arrivals of people who considered themselves settlers in a place that was already settled. These were not comfortable thoughts, but they were honest ones, and neither Cora nor Vernon was a person who preferred comfortable dishonesty to honest discomfort. They spoke of it with Roberto and Dolores Vega, who had more history in the territory than anyone, and Roberto, who was a man of great patience and considerable experience with the weight of these matters, said one evening, "The land does not belong to those who claim it. The land belongs to those who care for it. I have seen many claimers and few carers. You too are carers." Vernon held that and turned it over for a long time. The fall of that second year brought the anniversary of the barn, which Cora and Vernon had taken to marking with a private and slightly absurd ceremony that consisted mainly of Vernon going to the barn and pressing all the joints and declaring them still sound, and Cora following him and agreeing, and both of them standing in the barn remembering the first conversation and the rain. "Still sound," Vernon said, pressing the corner joint of the back wall, which was his best work and he knew it. "Still sound," Cora agreed. She was pregnant again, which she had told him 2 weeks before, in the same kitchen, same morning coffee, same direct and unelaborated delivery of news. He had responded in the same way as before, standing up and taking her hands and asking how she was, and she had said good and then said, "I think it is a girl this time," and he had said, "Then she will be magnificent," as he had promised, and she had held his face in her hands and said, "You are very predictable, Vernon Dunlap," and he had said, "You said predictable is the most interesting quality you know," and she had kissed him because he was right. In June, Cora's sister, Clara Harmon, arrived from Missouri on the train, a thing that had not been possible 2 years ago and now was, and it was the first time Cora had seen her sister in 6 years, since before Thomas died, since before me was old enough to remember anything. Clara was 2 years younger than Cora and had the same dark eyes but a louder laugh, and she arrived with a trunk of Missouri fabrics and a great deal of opinions about everything, and me attached herself to her aunt within the first hour and extracted from her every detail of Missouri she could think of, and Eli followed Clara everywhere like a devoted and bewildered puppy. Clara met Vernon and looked at him for about 45 seconds and then told Cora in the kitchen, in a low voice that was not low enough, that he was solid-looking and appeared to genuinely listen when people talked to him, and that the porch extension was a very fine thing, and she could see why Cora had married him. Vernon, who had heard this clearly from where he was sitting on the solid porch, chose not to mention it for approximately 3 days and then could no longer resist and told Cora, and Cora covered her face with her hand and then laughed until her eyes watered, and Vernon looked satisfied. Clara stayed for 5 weeks, and in that time she helped Cora with the new sewing she had in mind for the house, winter curtains and a new quilt, and she taught me a recipe for a pie that Clara claimed was the Harmon family's, though Cora disputed this energetically, and she rode out with Vernon one afternoon to look at the Cassidy livery in town that he had rebuilt, and came back and said to Cora, "He built that." And Cora said, "He organized the whole thing," and Clara looked at her and said, "Cora Blackwell, Cora Dunlap." "You did all right," and Cora said, "I know," with a quietness and a certainty that Clara had never heard in her sister's voice before, not even in the good years with Thomas, and she thought that the territory had done something particular to her sister, had made her harder in the ways that usefully harden and softer in the ways that matter. When Clara left, me stood at the gate to watch the wagon take her aunt to the station, and me's face was very carefully arranged, and Cora stood beside her and said nothing, and after a while me said, "She will come back." "She said she would," Cora confirmed. "You can rely on people who say what they mean," me said. Cora looked at her daughter, 10 years old, nearly 11, with her serious, careful eyes and her books and her particular and exact quality of mind, and thought about all the women me was going to be, this one and many others, and said, "Yes, you can." In November, the second baby arrived, as predicted, a girl. She was smaller than Jamie had been and quieter in her first announcement to the world, but her eyes, when they opened, were dark and direct and watchful, and Vernon looked at her and said, "She has your eyes, Cora." "She has your forehead," Cora said. "I am going to take that as a compliment." "You should. It is a good forehead. Honest." They named her June, for the month in which they had told each other they loved each other, which had been a June evening on the porch with the fireflies just starting up. An evening neither of them had planned to say it, and both of them had said it almost at the same time, and then laughed and then been serious. The way important things sometimes happen, without ceremony and with everything. June Margaret Dunlap, the Margaret for Cora's mother who had died when Cora was 12. A woman she still missed in the specific way you miss someone who taught you how to be strong before you knew you needed to be. Eli, now 7, received his new sister with considerable authority and very specific opinions about what she should be allowed to do. And Jamie, at 10 months, was simply baffled by the new presence in the house, and expressed this bafflement by sitting nearby and watching June with round, solemn eyes. Me held June on the first evening, carefully and correctly, sitting in the rocking chair with the baby cradled in the crook of her arm, and she looked at her little sister for a long time, and her face was the most open Cora had ever seen it, the composure set entirely aside. "Hello, June," she said softly. "I am me. I will tell you everything I know." Cora, watching from the doorway, pressed her fingers to her lips and went into the kitchen so that no one would see her face. That winter was a good one, in the particular way that good winters are in the high desert, cold and clear and still, the land resting under an occasional thin snow that turned the sage to crystal, and the red earth to white and back to red again as it melted. The Dunlap household was warm and full. The workshop kept Vernon in steady work through the cold months when the building crews in town were quieter. The cattle were doing well, and Archero's wife Lucia had become a friend to Cora in the unhurried, certain way that good friendships build themselves. In the evenings, Vernon read to the children by the fire, all 4 of them distributed around the sitting room, me with her book open beside her in case Vernon was reading something she had already covered, Eli lying on his stomach on the rug, Jamie propped against Vernon's leg, and June in Cora's arms. They read history because me required it, and adventure because Eli required it, and sometimes Vernon made up stories about a horse named Copper who had adventures in the territory. And these stories had the particular quality of invented stories told by someone who is paying close attention to his audience, calibrated to exactly what is needed, full of the details only an attentive man notices. Cora listened from her chair, rocking June, and sometimes she caught Vernon's eye over the children's heads, and they would look at each other, and the look contained everything, the gratitude and the ease and the deep ordinary joy of it, and then one of the children would demand more Copper the horse and Vernon would continue. He was never late. Not once. Not for supper, not for the school events in town, not for the church social in spring, not for the planting in March, not for anything that mattered. He arrived early to things, had been arriving early to things since October of '82 when he had stood in Cora's yard with wood shavings on his hands, and understood that he had some making up to do, and the habit had become simply who he was. A man who arrived before he was needed so that if anything required adjusting there was time. Cora never forgot the rain. She mentioned it at intervals that Vernon had come to regard with a kind of fond helplessness at the 1-year anniversary, at the 2-year, at the moment a rainstorm was coming in, and she could feel the weather turning, at the occasional random Tuesday when it seemed to come to her mind unprompted, and she would say over the supper table, 2 hours in the rain, Vernon, and Eli, by now well acquainted with the legend, would ask what the rain was like. And Cora would describe it with a completeness of detail that grew modestly more dramatic with each retelling. And Vernon would listen with the patient acceptance of a man who has long ago understood that this is not about the rain. "You are not actually still angry," he said one evening after a particularly vivid account delivered to a fully attentive audience of 3 children and a bemused husband. "I am not angry," she agreed easily. "I am commemorating." "Commemorating," he repeated. "The rain is part of the story," she said. "If there had been no rain and no late arrival and no standing at the gate for 2 hours, there would have been none of this," he finished. So the rain is important, she said. And I am commemorating it. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, I will be commemorating it with you then. Good, she said. You should, you caused it. I caused it, he agreed. And I am not sorry. She looked at him, and the almost smile was there, wide open and fully itself now after 2+ years of being slowly warmed into something. And she said, Neither am I. The spring of '85 came in warm and early, the desert blooming extravagantly as it sometimes did when the winter rains had been generous, the hillsides covered in flowers that had no business being there, and were there anyway, that particular gorgeous defiance of inhospitable land when it decides to be beautiful. Me turned 13 in March, and the discussion about the school in Santa Fe was a real one now. Letters exchanged with the school and the arrangements explored. And in June, she would make the journey with Vernon, who had business in Santa Fe that would take 2 weeks and had offered to see me settled before he came back. It was a practical arrangement, and a sad one, and Cora managed it with her usual clarity, and the private grief of it tucked somewhere internal, where it did the work it needed to do without preventing anything. On the morning of me's departure, she and Cora stood in the kitchen before anyone else was up, in the particular intimacy of early morning and imminent goodbye, and me was wearing her traveling dress and her hair was pinned properly for the first time in her life, and Cora thought that her daughter was already, in some essential way, the woman she was going to be, complete and particular and formidable in the best sense of the word. Write every week, Cora said. Every week, me said. If anything troubles you, I will write, or send a telegram. I know how telegrams work, Mama. I know that you know. Cora took her daughter's face in her hands. You are magnificent, me. You always have been. You are going to be extraordinary. Me held very still for a moment, and then she hugged her mother with both arms and Cora held on. Eli came in, sleep-rumpled, and said, Is me going today? With the tone of someone who has known this for weeks but is only now letting it be real, and me said, Today. And Eli hugged her too, and Jamie, who was 1.5 and had no idea what was happening, toddled over and hugged Eli because hugging seemed to be what was happening, and June, in Cora's arms, patted me's face with small patting hands. Vernon and me departed in the morning light, the wagon loaded with me's trunk and Vernon's tools and supplies for the return trip, and Cora stood at the gate with the 3 smaller children and watched the wagon go down the road, and me turned and waved once, with the composure of a person heading toward her future, and Cora raised her hand. The gate was open and the road ran straight to the horizon, and Cora stood at it in the clear June morning and felt the fullness of things, the grief of the leaving and the pride of the going, the permanence of the property around her and the forward movement of her children through it, and the solidness of everything Vernon had built and was still building. The road was empty again, but she was not waiting. She was watching, which was a different thing entirely. Vernon was back in 10 days, having left me settled and eager at the school in Santa Fe, having letters from me already, 2 of them, describing the school library with a thoroughness that made Cora laugh and cry and then laugh again. He came through the gate in the mid-afternoon and she was at the porch, and he climbed down and she said, Well. She walked through the door of that school as though she owned it, he said. The headmistress looked at her and then looked at me and said, This is an exceptional young person, and I said, I know. Cora sat down on the top porch step and Vernon sat beside her, and they looked at the property in the afternoon light. She will be all right, Cora said. She will be extraordinary, Vernon said, exactly as you told her. Cora leaned her head on his shoulder, and the afternoon light was gold on the red earth, and Jamie was in the yard trying to chase a roadrunner that was significantly faster than him, and Eli was in the workshop making something that involved a great deal of hammering, and June was asleep inside, and the barn was sound at the back, and the south porch was catching the last of the afternoon sun, and the front door had its scrollwork latch, and the root cellar had its good new hinge. Vernon, Cora said. Yes. Are you happy? He turned and looked at her, and his face was the wide-open, honest face of a man for whom the answer to this question was the simplest thing in the world. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said. She held that for a moment, let it settle in like the sun after a long rain. "Good," she said. "So am I." The Roadrunner escaped Jamie and disappeared into the sage, and Jamie looked after it with a furious and philosophical expression. And Cora and Vernon laughed together in the gold afternoon, and everything was as it should be, and the gate was open, and the road ran easy and clear. And this was the life they had built from a rainstorm and a late arrival, and a woman who had waited at her gate and been angry enough to refuse to let it go, and a man who had been late once and never once again. The seasons turned and turned, and the desert did its old patient work, and the Dunlap property grew and thrived, the herd larger and the workshop established, and the children growing into the people they were always going to be. And Cora and Vernon moved through their days with the particular grace of two people who have found the right configuration and know it, who have learned each other's rhythms and hold them gladly, who have built something from difficult country and effort and honesty and the stubborn willingness to show up every time on time for everything that matters. He was never late again. She never let him forget the one time he was. And every year in October, when the rains came down and the desert went dark, and the smell of wet sage filled the air, Cora would stand on the south porch that Vernon had built her, with the iron scrollwork latch on the front door and the sound barn at the back and the children's voices in the house, and she would look at the road and think about a woman standing at a gate in the rain, waiting for something that had not yet come. And she would feel for that woman a tenderness that was almost like pity and almost like gratitude, because that waiting had led here to this, to the solidity of what they had made, and she would not have changed a single cold, wet minute of it. Vernon would find her there on the porch in the October rain smell, and he would come and stand beside her, and he would know what she was thinking, and he would say nothing, and she would say nothing, and the desert would be all around them, wide and patient and very old, and the light would be the light of a place that does not promise anything but gives everything, and that would be more than enough. That would be exactly right.